On April 15, 2013, the Boston Marathon was underway. Thousands of runners had spent hours pushing their limits, while families and friends waited near the finish line on Boylston Street. At 2:49 p.m., a sudden blast tore through the crowd. Just 12 seconds later, a second explosion followed. In less than a minute, the world's oldest annual marathon was transformed into a scene of smoke, blood, and chaos.
The Boston Marathon was not just another road race. It was the oldest annual marathon in the world, first run in 1897, and had become a symbol of endurance and tradition. Every year on Patriots' Day, a local holiday in Massachusetts that commemorates the opening battles of the American Revolution, thousands of runners from across the globe converged on Boston. The race wound its way through suburban streets and into the heart of the city, ending along Boylston Street, a stretch that had come to represent triumph for generations of athletes. By 2013, the marathon was in its 117th year. That morning, more than 23,000 runners took their places at the starting line. The competitors included elite athletes from Kenya and Ethiopia, local New Englanders running for charity, and amateurs chasing personal milestones. The field reflected the diversity of the event. Old and young, professionals and first-timers, all sharing the same course. Along the route, the atmosphere was festive. The Boston Marathon was as much a community event as an athletic competition. Families came early to set up chairs, children waved flags, and volunteers handed out water. Entire neighborhoods turned out to cheer, creating a corridor of sound that carried runners from town to town. By midday, tens of thousands of spectators had filled downtown Boston, pressing close to the metal barricades that lined the finish area. Boylston Street was a wall of voices, with cheers echoing between tall buildings. Near the finish line, excitement was building. As the clock ticked toward the 4-hour mark, the course filled with amateur runners, the people for whom finishing the race was a lifelong dream. For many, this was the most emotional stretch, where exhausted athletes found new strength in the roar of the crowd. The sidewalks were packed with parents, siblings, and friends, many holding cameras to capture the final steps. The finish line itself was heavily decorated. American flags fluttered in the breeze, while banners and sponsor signs framed the road. On the viewing stands, local officials and race organizers watched as wave after wave of runners crossed. Nothing seemed unusual. For more than a century, the Boston Marathon had been safe, a day when strangers celebrated together in the open air. But beneath the surface, small vulnerabilities were present. Security at the marathon had not been designed to withstand deliberate attack. Backpacks and bags were common along the course. Barricades kept the crowd off the street, but offered little protection against someone determined to cause harm. On that Patriots' Day in 2013, those gaps in safety would become tragically clear. By the early afternoon, runners continued to arrive, and the finish line grew more crowded with families waiting to reunite. Children perched on shoulders for a better view. College students cheered from balconies overlooking Boylston Street. Tourists took photos against the backdrop of banners and flags. It was a celebration of human endurance, a moment of collective pride for the city of Boston. No one could have imagined that within minutes the cheers would be replaced by explosions. The very place that symbolized triumph and resilience was about to become a scene of devastation.
The afternoon of April 15, 2013 was clear and cool, almost perfect weather for running. By the time the clock approached 2:45 p.m., the elite athletes had long since finished. What remained on the course were thousands of amateur runners, the ones who had trained for years simply to cross the line. For many, this was the most meaningful moment of their lives. Boylston Street was lined with cheering crowds. Children waved homemade signs. Families leaned over barricades, waiting to spot loved ones among the steady stream of exhausted athletes. At 2:49 p.m., everything changed. A sudden flash erupted on the north side of Boylston Street, just beyond the finish line. The first explosion sent a dense cloud of white smoke billowing upward, scattering debris across the pavement. The sound was deafening, echoing between the tall buildings that lined the street. For an instant, people froze in confusion. Some thought it was a cannon or a celebratory firework. That illusion lasted only seconds. 12 seconds later, a second bomb exploded farther down the street, near the Forum restaurant. The second blast was louder, sharper, and instantly confirmed that the city was under attack. Panic spread in waves through the crowd. People screamed and scattered in every direction. Flags from around the world which had been strung along the barricades to celebrate international runners were shredded by shrapnel. The bombs had been packed into pressure cookers and hidden inside backpacks left near the sidewalk. The force of the blasts ripped through spectators standing only feet away. Many were thrown to the ground, their bodies torn apart by metal fragments. Limbs were severed instantly. Shoes, hats, and bags were hurled into the air. Survivors later recalled the overwhelming smell of smoke mixed with blood and the sound of people crying out for help. The first moments after the explosions were chaotic. Runners who had just crossed the finish line staggered in disbelief, looking back at the smoke. Some collapsed from exhaustion and shock. Others instinctively ran toward the injured, tearing off shirts to use as tourniquets. Parents clutched their children and tried to flee, only to be slowed by the dense crowd in the barricades that blocked the sidewalks. Among the victims was 8-year-old Martin Richard, who had been standing with his family near the first blast. His mother and sister were also gravely injured. Nearby, 29-year-old Crystal Campbell was killed instantly. Across the street, Ling-Ji Lu, a graduate student from China, was mortally wounded. In total, 3 people lost their lives that day, but the human cost was far greater. More than 260 others were injured, many suffering devastating injuries that would change their lives forever. The scene along Boylston Street was described by witnesses as resembling a war zone. Smoke filled the air. Broken glass littered the sidewalks. Blood stained the pavement where spectators had once cheered. Shoes lay scattered in piles, left behind by people who had fled or by victims who could no longer wear them. Bicycles, strollers, and cameras were abandoned in the rush to escape. First responders and volunteers rushed in almost immediately. Police officers tore down barricades to allow emergency vehicles through. Medics set up triage stations directly on the sidewalk. In the absence of proper equipment, belts and shoelaces were used as makeshift tourniquets. Firefighters carried victims away on stretchers made from crowd control fencing. Within minutes, ambulances began streaming toward nearby hospitals, carrying patients who had lost limbs or were bleeding heavily. Boston hospitals were quickly overwhelmed. At Massachusetts General Hospital, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Boston Medical Center, emergency rooms filled with patients arriving in waves. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, performing amputations, stitching wounds, and attempting to stabilize those on the brink of death. In many cases, decisions had to be made in seconds. Who could be saved and who could not? On Boylston Street, the horror unfolded in front of thousands of witnesses. Some survivors described the eerie silence that followed the second explosion, broken only by cries for help. Others recalled the smell of gunpowder mixed with burned clothing. Cell phones failed as networks became overloaded, leaving families desperate to contact loved ones. Runners who had been only blocks away were stopped in their tracks, diverted off the course with no understanding of what had just happened. The contrast between the moments before and after the blasts was striking. What had been a celebration of endurance and human spirit was transformed in seconds into a scene of mass casualties. The very spot where families had gathered to cheer triumphs became a place of mourning and terror. In the hours that followed, investigators combed through the wreckage. Shrapnel from the bombs was lodged in storefronts and embedded in the pavement. Pieces of pressure cookers and blackened backpacks were recovered, evidence that pointed to a carefully planned attack. Surveillance footage captured images of two men calmly walking through the crowd with backpacks and leaving them behind shortly before the blasts. Those images would soon dominate news broadcasts across the country. But in those first few hours, the focus was survival. Victims were rushed into surgery. Families searched hospitals, desperate for answers. And the city of Boston, still in shock, was only beginning to understand that it had experienced a deliberate act of terror. The Boston Marathon, a tradition of unity and perseverance, had been turned into a crime scene. The finish line, once a symbol of triumph, was now a place of devastation. For the runners who never reached it, the race ended in fear and confusion. For the survivors, the scars would last a lifetime.
In the hours after the explosions, downtown Boston was locked in shock. Sirens filled the air as emergency vehicles rushed victims to nearby hospitals. Streets were evacuated, leaving abandoned shoes, strollers, and half-eaten food scattered along the sidewalks. Investigators quickly determined that the blasts had been intentional. Shattered fragments of metal, nails, and pressure cooker lids were recovered from the crime scene. These were no accidents. They were bombs built to maim and kill. Hospitals treated more than 260 injured people, many with severe burns and traumatic amputations. Surgeons performed dozens of life-saving operations within the first night. The horror was not confined to the finish line. It spread into emergency rooms, where families waited for word on their loved ones. Despite the chaos, Boston hospitals managed to keep every critically injured patient alive after they arrived. As the city struggled to recover, federal agents launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. Surveillance footage from Boylston Street revealed two young men carrying heavy backpacks. They were seen calmly walking through the crowd, leaving the bags on the ground and walking away. These images, released to the public, identified the suspects as brothers Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. On April 18th, just 3 days after the bombing, the search turned violent. The brothers ambushed and killed MIT police officer Sean Collier, attempting to steal his weapon. Hours later, they carjacked a vehicle and led police on a desperate chase through the streets of Watertown. The pursuit ended in a fierce firefight. Dozens of homemade explosives were thrown at officers. Tamerlan was killed during the confrontation, while Dzhokhar escaped on foot. For nearly an entire day, Boston was placed under lockdown. Residents were ordered to stay indoors as thousands of law enforcement officers searched house by house. Public transportation was shut down, businesses closed, and one of America's largest cities fell silent. The sense of fear was overwhelming, but so was the determination to find the attacker. On the evening of April 19th, a homeowner in Watertown noticed blood on his boat parked in the backyard. Police surrounded the area and discovered Dzhokhar Tsarnaev hiding inside. After a tense standoff, he was captured alive. He was later tried in federal court, convicted on all counts, and sentenced to death. In the investigation, the bombs had been constructed using instructions found online, packed with shrapnel designed to cause maximum damage.
The attack was motivated by extremist ideology, carried out by two brothers who had lived quietly in the United States for years. In the aftermath, the city of Boston united under the slogan, "Boston Strong." Vigils were held for the victims. Donations poured in for survivors who faced long recoveries. The marathon returned the following year with heightened security, symbolizing resilience in the face of terror. But for many, the scars never faded. Children grew up without parents. Survivors learned to walk again with prosthetics. And the finish line of the Boston Marathon, once a place of celebration, became forever marked by tragedy.